Good afternoon. Welcome to PureCyber's webinar on supply chain attacks within cybersecurity. Today, we're going to explore the critical aspects of protecting your supply chain from cyber threats. So you've got the three of us here today. So for anyone who doesn't know us, I'm John. I'm the Chief Information Risk Officer at PureCyber.
I'm Tom. I'm the Chief Offensive Security Officer.
And I'm Matt, I'm the Chief Defensive Security Officer.
So yeah, the three of us will go through today and chat through various different topics for discussion. So I suppose setting the scene with all of this, we are seeing a rise in attacks from a supply chain perspective. They're becoming more prevalent, they're becoming more newsworthy as well. But it's just essential to ensure robust security measures across your supply chain to make sure that you're sort of mitigating against any, I suppose, operational disruptions, financial loss, data breaches, all of that we see on a daily basis. So today we'll go through and we'll discuss what we're seeing in the wild. So Matt's got some case studies to kind of talk through as well. We'll talk through how we can identify potential vulnerabilities within the supply chain. So how to monitor them, what you sort of should be looking for, and then again, best practices for protecting against the supply chain as well. So strategies to adopt and the best practice that we recommend from our perspective as well. So a bit of housekeeping, the session will be recorded, and for ease, if you want to ask any questions or join the conversation, please feel free to add comments for the chat and we'll discuss them during the Q&A at the end. So I suppose best place to kick off really is with Matt and his sort of examples around case studies and what we're seeing in the real world. So I think from your perspective, Matt, what are you seeing? What sort of issues are they? And are they split into any, I suppose, particular categories of supply chain?
Yeah, look, where do you start really? So for me, the supply chain is kind of cut into three at the minute. You have your kind of physical supply chain. So we're seeing a lot at the minute going on with this. The biggest probably example and the most recent one is the London NHS cyber attack. So Synovus, which are, I think, the blood lab work, they do all the blood work for a lot of the hospitals around the London area. They got hit at the beginning of June and everything got ransomware. And at the minute, I believe they're saying and predicting it's going to be about 6 months until you can get a blood sample kind of work back. If you move that along then to kind of more your digital supply chain. So this can be anything from your website. So a recent one is WordPress. WordPress has, if you may not know what it is, but a lot of websites use WordPress as their kind of back end. Now you can integrate something called a plugin, which allows a different functionality into that site. Now these plugins, back at just the end of June, a couple of them had some malicious code injected into them, and about 36,000 sites used these plugins. And because this malicious code got injected into them, it allowed a backdoor, so pretty much anybody could access the back end of these WordPress sites. Just yesterday, Java library got breached, I think, with best word. So what happened here was this Java, I can't remember what it's called, but the company got bought out by a Chinese company. Then that got, again, malicious code injected into it, and that affected around 102,000 sites. And then if you moved from digital to kind of where I think is the middle ground between these, it's your kind of IT MSP. Now, the worst kind of example I can think of for these is one that happened not that long ago where an IT MSP got impacted by a piece of ransomware, and due to it wasn't just them who was affected, it was their clients. So instead of having one incident to deal with, you had 14, 15, and because that IT MSP was so integrated into all of their environments, everybody got hit the exact same.
Well, a lot of those customers as well would have, I suppose, inherent trust within the IT MSP, and if they're going for an incident, I suppose from that point of view, where do they go to for any help if they're one point of contact's going through a similar incident? But I suppose with yourself, Tom, and the work that you do from a more of an offensive side, what are you seeing? What are the sort of the attack vectors? Is there a particular pattern that is emerging across particular hacking groups or anything like that that points to these areas?
I think if I look back at the vectors of how supply chains are targeted, there's no one size fits all. I think it really depends on what you're trying to attack. I think taking some of Matt's examples are really good. Thinking of the purely digital attack and I'm going to call it the digital supply chain. You think about how many bits of software either you use directly or you use indirectly as they're a prerequisite for something else you use are actually maintained by online creators. They're sort of free and open source, or they're maintained by one man out of his garage in Milwaukee in the US, and it's been going that way for the last 20 years. All of our software is so underpinned now, and everybody's contributing to try and be helpful. But how do you know you can trust that contribution, whether that's inside a company in terms of the supply chain, or whether that's open source and just committed to by the community? So that one's always really difficult to do and mitigate because of how many people get involved. From an IT MSP, you're right, actually, it's a really interesting one because they're so integrated. You normally get an IT MSP because you don't have the skills or the knowledge internally. And that's perfectly acceptable. And you outsource the day-to-day responsibility for everything from patching, email security, whatever that may be. The problem you have then fundamentally is, are you actually auditing that your MSP is doing what they told you they're going to do? We do loads of cyber essentials plus assessments. One of the simple steps though is cybersecurity. And the number of companies that fail at the first hurdle of simply keeping their devices up to date. I mean, all right, yes, we're seeing less device targeting now because in practice, people are now going after credentials. So we're seeing more credential stuff in attacks where people are reusing credentials from previous data breaches. But that comes back to you being secure and having good passwords. So I think the honest answer is really, you sort of have to step out the technical to begin with and look back at the governance side, which is obviously where you focus to work out what controls you need in place.
Yeah, it's like we always say with everything, isn't it? It's where your data sits, how you're managing it, what you're doing with it, whether that's internal data resource, external. So it's been with a supplier as well. But I think with the NHS stuff, I mean, do we know yet how they got in? Do we know anything around sort of the attack vector with that? Was there anything they could have done to prevent it? Or is it phishing as like 9 times out of 10 most stuff is nowadays, right?
Yeah, so even though what happened back at the start of June was, don't think any kind of initial access details has been kind of being described actually at the minute. So we're unsure what went on there. But with all the cases I've been on, and probably Tom would be the same, it's always really, really simple and sometimes silly mistakes, right? Most of the time it comes down to patching of these actual vulnerable systems, knowing where those vulnerable systems could be. So having systems sitting on the internet, one of the biggest things is what is on the internet for us and how does that access our data? The last example I was on, because they didn't patch that one system that was sitting on the internet, it gave the attacker full access straight into the organization. If they had patched it, wouldn't have happened.
And it was who was responsible for that patching though? It wasn't the organization that got breached, was it? That was
that was it. It was what Tom was coming on to earlier around kind of the trust element more than anything. We had a case yesterday with CEP that, they asked, well, what verification are you doing on that patching? Well, it's in our SLA that they've got to do it. Okay, but there's too much trust there and they just need to take it back for themselves.
You can outsource the responsibility, but you can't really outsource the accountability with a lot of these things. I think for me, from my side, what I'm seeing, or if I was going on the attacking front, what would be the ways I'm breaking in? Exposure is the first one. So particularly things like remote desktop protocol or Citrix or those type of environments being exposed. That's a nice, easy avenue in, either through vulnerabilities themselves or through credentials that we can gather from other places. I mean, the vulnerabilities is a really interesting one. We're seeing the time from publication to exploitation getting shorter and shorter. We think back a couple of years, we were saying to patch within 30 days. Now the guidance is to patch within 14 days. I mean, some of the recent vulnerabilities, we're actually seeing active exploitation of those within 24 hours of a thing. So that's emphasizing why it's so critical to be on top of your patching, because you're able to start to defend against those sort of quick turnaround attacks. But I think actually a lot of the breaches we're seeing now is sometimes less vulnerability related and actually more human related. I mean, we've moved in the last couple of years from physical devices and on-prem infrastructure to cloud, and instead of a device being the linchpin of your business, it's now your credentials. So people breaking into Microsoft 365 accounts or G Suite accounts, and that then gives them access to all the other apps and services that you use as a business. So securing user credentials is a good one. Preventing password reuse across different systems, strong passwords is a key one.
It's the basics of any sort of cyber awareness program, isn't it? It's the stuff you should basically do with an induction for start. Don't reuse passwords. Don't sign up for personal stuff on your organizational email, things like that. I think you mentioned a point there about the SLA side of things as well, right? So with a lot of, I suppose, contracts now, you have an SLA, but if there's any sort of ownership change or anything that comes across that they have to tell you. But I suppose with the Java incident, did they notify, you said it was like 102,000 people, companies, organizations, users?
Website, yeah.
I imagine they didn't tell them they were being sold to a Chinese entity.
Because at the end of the day, maybe it doesn't state in their kind of contract, and most of the time it's open source software and licensing off that tool, right? So it's really hard to actually, as a client or a customer of that, maybe it's a plugin, maybe it's a piece of software, to dictate to kind of imagine dictating the rules to Microsoft, right? It's never going to happen. So it sometimes takes security back for yourself in elements.
I think contracts and SLAs are a really good one. If we look at a recent breach to a local sporting organisation, I mean, they outsourced their membership platform to a third party. That membership platform, for all intents and purposes, was secure in its original instance. That supplier decided they were going to do a technology migration. They went from supplier A to supplier B. And as part of that migration, they did a backup or an external storage of that data temporarily in an AWS bucket. Turns out, though, that AWS bucket, although secure by default, they'd done some changes to the configuration and left it public and open to the internet. And in their security research company, thankfully, had gone round the internet, found this bucket publicly exposed, containing around 70,000 people's data. Now, who is at fault there? It's arguably the supplier. Did they have to tell their customers they were doing this migration change? Should they have? Is a whole different question.
I mean, usually a customer wouldn't really, I suppose, from our bat an eyelid, would they? If you're making a configuration change to a SaaS platform, then they don't care, as long as, and this is where it comes down to, isn't it? You put loads of trust in suppliers, and all you really, well, a lot of the time, it's uptime is the main focus for a lot of companies, is it? And that's, I suppose, where you've got to balance it. Do you put in effective security controls across your supply chain and really hone in on that level? Or do you have a fully operational supply chain, which gives you more freedom to do what you need to do? So it's, what we always say, it's finding that balance, isn't it, between the two?
That one was interesting though, right? Because although it wasn't the sporting company's fault, could have the sporting company been quicker to act and know what data was held there, right? So again, it's bringing back to where John kind of lives. It's that data mapping exercise, a supplier mapping, knowing, okay, I've given that provider, that software vendor, this data. How are they going to manage that? What are they going to do with it?
Like when you say where it lives, I imagine my house is a governance nightmare, and I fob in and fob out to every door that I go through. Whenever one of the kids moves a toy, it's like, right, that lives over there. So I think with the case studies and things like that, they're all really good examples. And what can you do about it? As I said, the data side of things and the governance is where I sit and figure out where you go. But are there any, I suppose, any sort of tools or recommendations that we use internally that we can share with people around the best way to manage it?
Yeah, look, you can always buy services and purchase tools. There's a lot of stuff on the internet that, people can go to and see stuff. News sites is the biggest one, right? Monitoring news, understanding what's coming out for them. We in the SOC, right, have a screen just for people who've been ransomware on that day. It's a free site on the internet, and we can see on maybe the 2nd of July, these companies got hit with ransomware. If we know one of those companies or one of our clients are using them as a supplier, we can inform that back to them, right? We're looking into new services now to actually monitor the actual company everywhere, pretty much. So as an example, you could put in PureCyber, and if one of our suppliers got ransomware and one of the files included PureCyber, we would get alerted to that. So there's so many different things that companies can do, really. And if Tom, you have any recommendations?
The first one was really interesting. A few weeks ago, I was doing a presentation up in Birmingham, and as on the background of one of my slides, it's a lovely background. I took a screenshot of the Lockbit ransomware website that showed which companies they had been breached. And it happened to be after the talk. I was sat down at the table. Someone came up to me and said, "Oh, just want to know that slide you had up. One of our suppliers were listed on the slide, and they'd been experiencing problems with their supplier for the past 3 months, not paying invoices or just generally being a little bit unresponsive, but didn't have any clue that their supplier had actually been breached in this way." So that was a really interesting one for them. They went and had some follow-up conversations with their supplier about that. And it just so happened to be in the background of one of the slides that they clocked and went. So I think for me, it's that openness. You mean, from a security perspective, you mean, what can your supplier do, or what would you do? You'd expect your supplier to match, if not exceed, what you want to do internally. But I think everybody's different. And I think realistically, what you've got to do is have your suppliers to some degree as part of your business. You've got to have that open communication strategy, whether they're making technical changes or infrastructure changes, or even if something goes wrong, you've got to have that respect and trust back and forth that we're able to communicate. Because without having that open communication channel, you're effectively operating as separate businesses, which is true, but then your data's with them or vice versa.
It's difficult when it gets to larger entities, though, isn't it? Because you're not going to get like Matt said earlier about Microsoft, you're not going to turn around and ask them about their infrastructure changes, because they'll just shrug and go, it's irrelevant, isn't it, really? So,
but it all comes back to probably, again, to you, John, that's the start of the relationship and setting boundaries. What do you expect as a client from them? And the same, what are they expecting anything from you? Yeah. And that's where we say, if you are going to tell that company you must meet these accreditations and these requirements, or are you going down a different path?
We started that, didn't we?
Yeah.
When we first started looking at our supply chain, sort of risk management piece, it was a certain level of accreditation or above, and we were happy with that. And we kind of said that's our comfort level, and anyone below that, we issued a questionnaire.
Yeah.
Now, when we got some of those questionnaires back from some of our suppliers, they didn't really make any sense to us. It didn't have an impact. But then when we actually took a step back and said, again, what sort of data's in there? What's the impact on us? We didn't really worry about them from a risk perspective, did we? So we've changed our whole approach to supplier risk management.
It's all about the severity and criticality.
Yeah, what data they hold.
You know,
I mean, they're holding your financial records, that's a different risk to if they're holding PII, which is a different risk to your intellectual property.
Yeah.
And it's about knowing where all that data sits and mapping it all out, because I imagine there's a lot of organizations who have, I mean, cloud software now is pretty free to use. You don't need to download anything, you don't need IT's involvement. So where shadow IT becomes a massive issue, that you have, people using cloud apps, but you won't know. And suddenly data sits within there, and that could be breached as part of a supply chain attack, and you wouldn't know about it. So it's again that central control of everything, isn't it?
But I was going to say on that, you can't defend against every attack. It's just fundamentally not possible. I mean, at some point, if somebody's determined enough to break into an organization or steal data, they're going to manage it. I mean, even as an organization, if you say we use SharePoint to share data, and that's our only approved path, so you can't stop somebody going registering for Dropbox. And even if you do, and you've got perfect web filtering or even perfect app control, somebody might just bring it up on the screen and take a photo of it on their phone. I mean, you can never prevent it, but it's about putting reasonable precautions in, but not making, I say, security too difficult to maintain and manage, but also making the secure option the easy option.
But I suppose with all of that, you've got, what do you do? Well, from what we've also talked about, case studies, you think of the IT MSP and their customers, the people who have been affected by Java, the Java incident. There's no real way to defend against the supply chain attack from what we're saying.
It's very hard. I don't think you can defend against it in entirety, but I think you can put some controls in place to make at least your visibility into that better. And I think going back to the IT MSP is a really good place. You outsource the responsibility to patch in, but you should really then audit that and be accountable to make sure that the MSP is doing what they're saying they're doing. And that can apply to every facet of supply chain and outsourcing of data responsibility, whatever that may be. Don't just throw it over the fence and forget about it. Throw it over the fence and keep peering over to make sure that they're actually doing what they say they're doing.
I think from my side, it's the common theme really in cyber, right? You can do everything possible from your point of view, but at the end of the day, if somebody wants to do something, they'll probably do it. So it's knowing what to do when the worst case scenario happens.
Spending your money wisely.
Yeah.
We know cyber's not necessarily a cheap service by and large. And actually, this is probably a good point to come in. We've got big businesses, your multinational companies, and you've also got small businesses. You've got Bob's Butchers on the side of the road with only 1 or 2 employees. And they both have cybersecurity risks. But actually, they've got 2 completely different approaches because of their size and scale. Now, should they be doing the same things? Probably. But can they afford to is a whole different question.
It's the basic principles, isn't it, of a lot of things. I think when we come down to it, like how do you actually mitigate the impact of a security attack? So like we've said before, you identify where your key points are, your data points, and you put security controls in place around them that I suppose you're comfortable with more than anything else. Like somebody might say you need to have MFA on one cloud application. That same cloud application, a company might turn around and say, well, we don't need MFA, we're comfortable with what data's in there. So it's kind of a risk we're willing to take. But I mean, is there anything else you can think of sort of mitigate against security, supply chain attacks?
I think the key one for me is just around visibility.
Yeah.
It's around knowing, you say, where your data is, who has access to it, what technology under use. So you can then have, whether that's as you say, a new sort of thing around research around what's going on with those. So you're keeping on top, whether that's from an MSP perspective, auditing what they're doing. So you've got that visibility. And you can hold either people to account, or you can make that risk decision of actually the supplier that we've got here has changed from when we signed them up, and we're not comfortable anymore. We need to put more controls in place.
What if you don't have, this is a very devil's advocate question, what if you don't have the skills to know that? So it's going to be a very particular company that has that knowledge and approach, isn't it? To be able to peer over the fence to keep an eye on what they're doing, right?
Yeah, and I think that, to be fair, I think that's where PureCyber come in really well. I think for a lot of businesses, keeping on top of things like patching, so there's a really good example. They don't want to do it themselves. They don't want the responsibility of doing it themselves. So they outsource that to an MSP. And likewise, how do they know it's working? And that's where I think we come in quite well, is we take that huge capital expenditure cost of buying the tools and the resources for doing that audit piece. And instead of making a customer spend 10, 15,000 pounds themselves, what we do is we spend that, so maybe a little bit more, and we provide that service at a much lower operational cost, so they can make it cost effective for their business, whether they've got 2 employees or 300.
I mean, even you think like Bob's Butchers down the road, if he had a laptop and he had an IT MSP and the IT MSP said they were doing patching every month, he could probably go in and look at his patching, right? And just run an update and see if it was from 2 months ago, 3 months ago.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate that. There's probably wider companies that need more, but there's probably stuff that smaller companies can do just as a sense check, right?
Yeah, they can. And actually, I think most companies that are been around up to 10 users in size generally are pretty hot on things like patching, because they all take that individual responsibility for it. Likewise, companies that are over probably 300-400 users in size can dedicate a technical resource, whether that be IT or a dedicated security team, to do that same thing as well. It's those in the middle, which ironically cover most companies, is the one where you struggle, because they haven't got the resource or the finance to dedicate time and resource to it, but it's too big now to be manageable by an individual user basis.
But that's why like services like Cyber Essentials Plus sometimes important, well, most of the time important, right? Because it's that one-off audit to make sure your IT MSP is doing its job, right? It covers, are they patching your machines? Are they providing security around your email? You know, all these things. So MFA is everything that we use. MFA as you know, a company has to ask them at themselves. So I think that as well is something that they could obviously go down.
That's like when you go down that governance framework type stuff, isn't it? Cyber Essentials, you're basically saying MFA needs to go into your supply chain, your cloud services. Good little start for any small business. You go to Cyber Essentials Plus, it tests against it. IASME, you start to look at the security accreditations of that supplier, but you've also got the MFA from Cyber Essentials, which is there. So again, gives you a little bit more, and you have a data asset register for an IASME. So that's again, a good way of mapping out where your data sits, what controls are in place. And then when you get something like ISO, where you end up with a lot more granularity around supply chain, and you end up with my horrible looking risk matrix that you all hate on a daily basis, but it gives you, you're always stepping that one step further, aren't you?
Yeah, like I think cyber essentials are they're both terrible and great at the same time. They're terrible because they're not flexible. And the amount of times we have a conversation, they go, well, we don't agree with that, it doesn't work for us. Mainly that's because they've become ingrained in a certain provider or technology which they're not willing to move. You mean I was dealing with a pen test last week where a customer still got a CERT 2012 box exposed on the internet with RDP publicly facing. Now, does it present them an immediate risk? Not really. Are they still getting some patching for it? Yes, they've actually moved it up to Azure, but really that went end of life in excess of 6 months ago. Yes, technically there are some limited security patches through till 2026 in Azure, but really they should already be looking at that forward planning strategy of replacing that server with something that is now going to be supported, modern, secure. And if I'm honest, it wouldn't surprise me at some point whether or not a vulnerability will come out in either RDP or Server 2012, which will end up with that server probably being breached because of that exposure that shouldn't really be there.
Is there anything else from a, I suppose, supply chain point of view where you could mitigate the impact of it? I know we do quite a lot like instant response simulations, and Tom, you've done loads of those previously. Is it value to do that for a company with the supply chain attack? I mean, there's not really a lot you can do from a supplier getting attacked, but
No, you can test though. You mean I think a really interesting part of you have to simulate an incident within your business because you can't simulate an incident within your supplier. But I think actually involving them in that is a really interesting part of, when we do instant response simulations, we might throw in curveballs, for example, of, let's say you've forgotten your password or you've left your laptop on a train. As part of that incident, instead of dealing with the ransomware or whatever the actual overarching incident is, you're pulling your IT team in, whether that's the internal or external or supplier, to try and do something. And you're testing really their SLA, but under a pressure situation. I've left my laptop on a train. How long does it take them to lock that laptop down or wipe the disk or whatever the appropriate control in your environment is? Because if that's going to take them 30 minutes, that might be perfectly acceptable. If it's going to take them 3 days, you might find that that risk is now too high, and you may need to renegotiate possibly your contract with your suppliers to work out how that balance works for you as a business.
Could be the other side of that, or like your productivity software. So you could have a Trello or Monday. What happens when that goes down, right? At the minute, most people won't think of those tools until the worst happens. Same as the internet connection. What happens when your internet goes off in the office? Who panics first? What do you do? Does everyone go home? Does everyone go to an internet cafe? What?
it's funny now because I suppose pre-COVID people would have panicked more. Now they're like, well, just go home and watch it. So there's a lot of like business continuity exercise or instant response was, we tested it during COVID. So well, that's not really cutting it anymore because the world's moved on so much.
But how many of them actually worked during COVID? And how many of them had 3 months off or they re-engineered their entire IT estate so that somebody could send emails again?
Yeah, it's true. But then when it comes to like, you talk through that and then you think back to the Java case study, none of that works.
No.
Testing your instant response across that doesn't really, testing the communication between a supplier doesn't work in that instance because then they've been bought out by another supplier, which then turns around to you've got a new contact, you've got a new stakeholder. Right?
I think that's probably where, at least on my side, where you sort of pull out of the supply chain itself and you start looking at you as business. And I think that's probably where Matt's team come in more than anything, of actually keeping on top of what's normal for you. If you've got your WordPress plugin on your website or your Java vulnerability as part of it, we can detect in so many ways. You can detect it from patching versions. Of somebody realizes an issue, which version are you running, and cross comparing that. But actually, Matt's team could probably do this a lot quicker and look at your business or your assets and go, well, what's normal? Are we starting to see a spike in activity that is abnormal? Just recently, we've got this SSH vulnerability. Was around a couple of years ago, was patched, was reintroduced. Still unsure exactly what happened there in that life cycle. But actually, to exploit it, you need probably around 10,000 attempts for it to be successful on average. So you sit there and you go, actually, when you're looking at your SSH server and the logs and graphing that, if someone's attacking you, you're likely going to see a massive spike. So we can detect it in so many different ways. Some of it could be governance, some of it can be offensive in terms of keeping on top of your security, but some of that can be defensive in terms of detection.
Exactly. Yeah, totally agree.
So yeah, we can cover it. This is where I always come back to. It's we know what we're covering and how to cover it and how to monitor it and how to look for it. I suppose I think we've covered case studies, how we identify vulnerabilities and what we do. But what would you do for, I suppose, your best practice, your mitigation? Where do we see the best way to mitigate or reduce the impact of a supply chain attack? Is it putting in security controls? Is it focusing on your SLAs? Is it monitoring? Where? I'll go Matt first. Where do you see it? So we're all going to have a different answer here.
I don't know. I think you have to start at that relationship. It's the first kind of, I want to go and grab a new piece of software, right? It's what we do a lot. And as part of that check,
You do a lot.
well, yeah. And as part of that thinking, yeah, great. You always think about the functionality, you always think about what you want, but it's also have to be in the back of your head. Is this thing that I'm bringing into my company, that I'm giving my data, sometimes critical data, is it going to be secure? And you just have to, and think that's where you start. Yes, you're going to have all your other suppliers that you're already with, but it is a roadmap. It is something that you have to slowly do. And I think for me, that's where it starts. It's very non-technical, but at the end of the day, John's going to love this because we always say it's the boring side of it.
I don't love that.
But, yeah, but it just is where you have to begin. Tom, for your
I think you're right. The non-technical approach is the right place to begin. I mean, if you go in trying to implement technical controls before knowing what you're comparing it against, you're going to fail every time. The technical side of things should be there to back up or reinforce what you've put into your policies and your procedures. But I think really for me, it's fundamentally simple steps. First of all, that if you think of a garden path, you've got your steps to cybersecurity, CEC plus at the beginning of that, but even breaking that further down, it's patching, passwords, MFA. I mean, the simple things that you can implement are generally going to get you 90% of the way there. I mean, you're never going to get 100%. You've got companies that are spending hundreds of millions of pounds a year on cybersecurity, and they still get breached. But the simple things make somebody ideally go to an easier target most of the time.
Makes me really happy you both gone down that route.
You have to go technical now.
Well, for me, it's all about the technical procedures we put in place. Yeah, you're right. There's not a lot. Like you said, you can have loads of companies who have so much technical capabilities but still get an issue with their supply chain. I think even you come down, something we haven't mentioned, user awareness.
Yeah.
Some customer gets breached or a supplier gets breached, and suddenly you get an email in from them, a spoofed email. When we saw it with one of the incidents you were on, right? But the incident came in, then they sprayed out to every single one of their suppliers and customers. And at that point, you've got to think, right, well, the only way to really protect against that as a company who's received that is user awareness, isn't it?
And you've got to think, what are their aims as well? I mean, we keep talking about supply chain attack, but why are you being attacked? What's the attacker's aim? Is it to steal intellectual property? Is it to deploy ransomware? Is it just to steal your usernames and passwords? Because actually, when you look at a lot of the attacks, they don't do a huge amount. Like just a few weeks ago, I had to deal with a very personal one. Somebody had broken someone's email, used that to compromise their Facebook and Instagram account. All they cared about was promoting their cryptocurrency scams. I mean, the risk and impact was really low, but somebody was really annoyed they couldn't get access to Facebook and scroll through Reels. Whereas on a business side of things, the same thing, and they could be there to steal your plans for your new fighter jet. I mean, you've got to work out what the attacker wants from that attack, because you can't defend every strategy.
So what do you reckon the best way is then for a business to start that process?
I think
we've talked about a lot of different avenues here, but where do you, if you think you've done nothing with your supply chain so far, you've got 30 suppliers on there with critical data in a few of them, where do you start?
Start at the beginning, asset management.
Yeah.
Most companies have got an idea of what they're doing in asset management in terms of laptops and desktops. Expand that out to be critical data. Talk about your intellectual property. Processes in some situations are how you work as a business. Map all that out, know where that data is, who has access to it. You then may choose, based on that risk vector, to go down and quiz certain suppliers more about how they're storing that data. But I think without nailing that, what you've got and where it is, you're going to really struggle to implement proper security controls down the line.
No, it's exactly that. It just is. You know, we said in F30, you probably don't, right? Because you'll keep adding to that list. Oh yeah, we have that piece of software we use.
You'll keep
To-
adding to that list.
You have, but that's what it is, don't it? You go, oh yeah, the accounts team use this little piece of software that we've forgotten about, and it's so easy to do though, right? Go around to each department or each person if you're a really small company and go, what do you use on a day-to-day basis? Or look at their bookmarks, right? What have they got bookmarked in their browser?
No, just do an audit across if you're using 365 or G Suite. Do an audit across your email log for the last month or how long you got retention. I don't care about what the email was, but just tell me who the sender was.
Yeah.
I guarantee if you look at just the domain of who sent you emails, you'll find a whole lot of services in there that you didn't realize somebody in your business was using.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you need to get rid of it. It gives you that visibility. And I think a lot of the time it's that knowing or being able to discover piece is the most important. So you can do that risk assessment.
Yeah, there's like this checklist that we've got, haven't we? And I think we're providing it at the end of this webinar is, I think really you want it as some sort of like flow chart, like what's the supplier? Is it critical data? If it's critical data, you ask this questions. If it's not critical data, so if you think physical suppliers, cleaners are a great example. Really, they're a supplier. They've probably got your email address, so there's a route in for any sort of phishing simulation. There's a relationship, there's physical security elements of if they propped open the door, then laptops could go missing, papers could be read if you didn't operate a good, clean desk policy. So I think it's all of that kind of rolled in that you.
It spirals out, doesn't it? That's the problem. Like, yeah, you're right. A cleaner. Actually, if you looked at us at PureCyber, sounds bad. We've got a lovely office. But really, for us, it's a series of desks and an internet connection. If somebody broke in here, the worst thing they could do is steal some coffee. Whereas actually,
Worst case scenario, Tom, I don't know what you're talking about.
whereas
So
that makes sense. But another supplier where actually they're hugely paper based, and you start to look at local government, particularly where they've got data records going back hundreds of years. The filing cabinet in the corner of that room could be the thing that's the biggest risk.
About mapping out from the start, isn't it? And going through those checks, and you might have 30 checks that you want to. You might only have 5. But again, it's, I suppose, yeah, like you say, it's starting that process, going, right, this is what we want to find out. This is what we're comfortable with as an organisation compared to someone else. Because I know that when I went through and did our supplier matrix, which you all love, is I've got, usually when it comes to risk, you get likelihood versus impact. I ended up putting a risk and a likelihood of phishing attempts internally and externally and looking at customer data and becoming
Yeah, most of us can only do 3D, John.
I wanted to do more, but it is that. So we have a much, I suppose, a more in-depth view of the nature of work we do, right? So
I think start for the basics. Even if you do it in small increments, and you might end up doing a risk strategy for your supply chain 10, 15 times, slowly adding bits in, but do little manageable steps and just take chunks out of it. If you try and do the whole thing at once, I think most people are going to get either fed up of doing it or give up.
But your maturity changes, right? So our supply chain risk management was nothing like, it wasn't like, it wasn't 10D, like today, right? It was just the likelihood, impact of that supplier, what would happen. And now, because we've matured, our supply chain has to mature kind of with us as well, and the future.
I think the other thing to think about, and your suppliers will hate you for thinking about this, but what is your resilience plan? I mean, for us, we use 365, Microsoft 365. What happens if that goes down? We use it for SharePoint, Teams, email. Do we have a resiliency plan? I mean, how long is your sort of recovery point objectives? I mean, if Microsoft goes down, how long before you fall over to using G Suite or another provider?
Because say G Suite's going to make a killing if
Microsoft goes down. But thinking about that redundancy, whether you use sort of ERP tools or things like that, can you easily back up that data and migrate into a third part, another supplier, whether that just be a boring Excel spreadsheet or whether that be another provider you can import data into? Because
boring Excel spreadsheet.
Resilience, I think, is key.
Yeah. But it is that, isn't it? It's knowing where it is, knowing what you do in an incident, so how you recover from it and building that resilience. That's the fundamentals of most of security, right?
Yeah.
Even with websites, even with your patching, it's building that resilience around it, which is why you might have 3 tools to do, your vulnerability scanning, your patching, your EDR, opposed to one.
Don't rely on patches. Are a really good example. I reckon 80-85% of patches will deploy automatically. I mean, your Windows patches, your web browsers all will basically fix themselves now. But sometimes things split through the gaps and just get missed. So that point, you're going to have probably your MSP or your internal sort of management tools, whether that be Intune or RMM tools, that then do the extra 10% to bring up to 95, 98%. And you hope then maybe that once a year sort of CE audit type thing is going to find the other couple of percent. Nothing's perfect, but it's about making steps in the right direction.
So I think, what do we have to cover today? Case studies, we've done that.
Done.
We identified vulnerabilities, how to identify vulnerabilities, and then best practice. I think if we got any more points on any of that.
My point of view,
I think the only thing I was going to say is about what happens when the worst happens. What do you do if your supplier has a breach? Is there some high level things that you can think about or do as an immediate sort of response to notify, understanding that one of your supply chain things have had a breach or an incident?
I suppose it depends on
just tracking it, right? Understanding what's happened, so making first contact, understanding what's happened and why it's happened. Is your data affected, right? And the most recent example I can think of is TeamViewer. Now, TeamViewer just got impacted by a breach. However, everyone goes, "Oh my God, TeamViewer!" And I saw LinkedIn, everyone to uninstall TeamViewer. However, that attack only impacted the internal network at TeamViewer, not the actual customer software side of it. It had no correlation, but because everyone saw TeamViewer got attacked, everyone started installing it. And it's not to panic, it's to understand what's happened. And then from there, put some controls in place.
I think that visibility part is good. I mean, I look back a month ago, we had the Ticketmaster breach.
Yeah.
That was an impact between Ticketmaster and one of their suppliers. But still, as far as I'm aware, Ticketmaster or the supplier haven't really come out with like an official statement on what happened, what was the impacted. So everything we know from the narrative has been really sourced from bits of data that have been leaked from places or sort of online controlled narrative. And without controlling that, all the Ticketmaster's customers, which is arguably every of us in the room, have already bought tickets to things, or their suppliers, you're sort of in this grey area if you don't really know what you can do. So making sure if you've got an SLA with your suppliers, that includes that they will be in contact with you within maybe 48 hours, 72 hours of identifying an incident, like they would with something like the ICO.
Yeah.
So that you're able to do your own risk mitigation as well.
That's when you need that sort of incident response simulation, isn't it, to know what you would do against each supplier. So you almost do like a mini scenario against supplier to supplier to supplier, and then do a curveball one that you might not know about, but actually your data sat there because you haven't done that original data sort of processing piece as well. So yeah, I think you're right. There's a lot of things you can do when you try and discover a supplier's had a breach. It's going to be right for you, isn't it? It's going to be right again, dependent on that situation per supplier, isn't it? But I think we've had 3 or 4 questions within the Q&A, so let's have a little look at those and see if there's anything that we can kind of cover off within it. So one of the questions we touched on your bare minimum for your suppliers. As a third-party supplier for other businesses, what's the best thing I can do to give our customers peace of mind? Okay, so flipping it around. So rather than assessing the supplier, what are you going to say to people?
I would say be more open and transparent.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of companies that I'm going to call it their press statements or their sales documents. They're all very aimed at selling or being written by lawyers, but actually people aren't robots. They want that human connection. Be a bit more open, talk about what the good bits that you do, because that actually might be a selling tactic for you.
Do you reckon that?
Sure.
So I think I'm coming at it from like when you go through tender processes.
Yeah,
It's like you get Cyber Essentials, I ask me, and it proves you've got a level of certification behind you. But like we said before, BAE ISO certified, a huge supply chain attack. SolarWinds a SOC 2, I believe it is.
Everything
Against huge supply chain attack. So
if you're going out to tender, actually that is what's going to give your customers peace of mind that you've done something.
Yeah.
Having those accredited may not make you completely immune to a cyber attack or a breach, but actually will give people that sort of reassurance that you have done something. So why not do those baselines?
You can always give them policies, show them around, bring them into a business as well, and show them what you do. Because I think nowadays we hear it a lot from our customers, don't we? You don't get to go and see the customer anymore because it's all teams, it's all backgrounds, and you don't get the real insight into what's going on.
Yeah, and I think just understanding actually what that supplier does. I mean, if they tell you they're going to do patching, or if they tell you they're going to do something, make sure what they told you they're going to deliver on, they actually are delivering on. So, and I mean, it's nothing better, really, as harsh, but a supplier that says, look, we haven't met our agreement with you this month, but this is what we're doing to fix it. That open and honesty builds trust, whether that's good or bad.
Yeah, also brings clawbacks in contracts and stuff like that, which is why it doesn't happen. And then I suppose second question we've got through. So web providers or suppliers are huge organizations handling our data, such as Microsoft, you mentioned, or HubSpot. Where can we start to know they are secure within their supply chain? What do you reckon? I'm gonna get you, Matt.
Yeah, we do a lot of this, right? Understanding what security they have. As you say, but most of the time we look at some key things. What do they say on their websites, right? So do they say they have ISO, NIST, or PISMA, whatever it is in terms of accreditations? Do they also go into like their security policy? Do they have stuff like they have how they encrypt their data at rest, at transport? Where they store in that data? They store it in the UK, they store in America. What is your threshold? Do you need to store it in certain locations? So I think that's where you start, really. Type in their name and go security or security policies, or if you're looking for a CP or ISO, do HubSpot ISO, see if they got those accreditations.
I think, yeah, certification is probably really the only way. You're not going to get Microsoft to fill out your 300 question onboarding supplier checklist, but you can make your own reasonable judgment call. I think the honest answer is actually it's less about the suppliers, it's more about you. You mean I could have a 365 account but never use it. So understanding what you want that supplier to do, what data they're going to be holding or processing on your behalf, because that will tell you what controls you want in place.
It's internal controls, isn't it? Do you put MFA on it? Do you back up your Microsoft 365 yourself, or do you do it on 365's tendency, which we know they also recommend don't rely on our backups, bring your own in, right? They even say that to people, so they've got that message out there.
What someone people forget as well is at the end of the relationship, a lot of people forget how they delete my data, how long do they keep my data in their system for? Because you may go, oh, it's fine. I haven't been a Ticketmaster customer for a long while, or I've been a customer on a platform for 10 years. Well, they might hold your data for 12, right? And you are impacted. So you need to know what is your data deletion policy. Are you going to get rid of me straight away, or am I going to have to wait 5 years until I'm clearing these systems?
And that is difficult because there are some things that they can't delete for various legal and compliance reasons, like financial data. You can say delete all my data, they still need to know you're a customer, how much money you spent with them.
Employee records is really important, right? Passports, how long do companies store that information for before they have to get rid of it?
And yeah, I think understanding that and all of that comes down to knowing what data you're sharing.
The question we got on there, so how can we integrate recommended cybersecurity strategies into our current supply chain management systems without disrupting operations? Right, let's break that down into 2 sentences. So how we can recommend integrating cybersecurity strategies into their current supply chain systems?
I think personally work out what you would do internally, cross-reference that then with your supply chain and see what they do, and slowly work through point by point. Doing things like MFA. Have you got MFA internally? Is that what you require? Great. Does your supplier support it? Awesome. Turn it on. Can you enforce it across the board? Just do it in small chunks. So I think if you try to make a huge change overnight, you're going to disrupt the operation because people are going to be locked out from it. If you do it in small chunks, it might be more manageable for the business.
So what is your blending model also? If the supplier doesn't offer those, what is your threshold for that risk?
I think it's going to be different for every business. I mean, if you're storing passport details, that's going to have a wholly different supply risk than somebody who's storing your public marketing PDFs. They're going to have 2 different risk vectors. You might say on the public stuff, we don't care, we'll accept an MFA, and they think, but you're going to have those thresholds internally.
Difficult, like you said, it's turning it on straight away because you will have. I mean, if you think of, let's go for the education sector, just as a general, and they don't have MFA on 365, but you turn it on overnight, and suddenly you have all of the teachers who can't log in the morning to then deliver the class because they haven't got the MFA set up correctly. It's that which is the disrupting of a business operation.
But I think even that is half the time it sounds horrible, but it's the lack of understanding. MFA doesn't just mean the token that comes up on your device. It could be something you are, somewhere you are. So for a school or an education environment, they might say, actually, if you're on site with us and you're coming out of our public IP address, we'll accept that that is MFA in itself. You're in a trusted location. So a lot of companies say, well, we can't do that. Actually, a lot of times they can. They just might have to think slightly differently about what that actually means, rather than just taking the top line from Google.
I think, conscious of time and us running out of the hour, so this is probably one of the more fun questions to answer, especially because it starts with you might not be able to answer. But what is the most disruptive supply chain attack you can remember seeing, hearing about?
Many of them.
I'm going to look at both of you two because you do a lot more in terms of instant response with the supply chain attacks.
Just so many, right? Like the last attack I was on, they were medical again, right? And they couldn't facilitate any of their clients, and the amount of money they lost because they couldn't get any of their customers or clients in to do any of their work, right? Like the most recent one is the ransom on NHS, right? The amount of patients, I think it's something like 2,000 outpatients, and again another 1,000 in whatever it was, who couldn't have surgery, right? And it's just that's the other part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, you could go back to something like the WannaCry ransomware that went round.
Yeah.
It's not strictly supply chain, but arguably Microsoft do your supply chain because they provide you Windows. It might be slightly indirect. I think for me, probably the worst attack that I had to deal with was a piece of critical asset infrastructure, which went from fully operational to not working at all pretty much overnight. For them, they dealt with it by having really robust physical processes. You had people running around with whiteboards and directing people, and actually they still operated as a bit. Yes, it took them 6 months to recover, but actually they built back securely, and I don't think the same attack would happen again. But they were really good. They were a really good example of how to sort of handle an incident right, even though the things went horribly wrong during the actual learning process.
That's one of the main things from any sort of attack, isn't it? It's the lessons learned for you always kind of, and then you can build more resiliency, more sort of security controls, more measures in place. It's not a nice situation to be in at the time, but you learn a lot.
You have to learn, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and it sounds stupid when we say you have to learn. We've seen people who don't learn, and it gets happen again and again and again. And you just, if this happens, it is a worst case scenario, but most of the time, hopefully, it's recoverable.
Yeah.
And as long as you know, right, yeah, that's how they happened, that's what they got in, this is what they did, this is how we could have stopped it, let's implement that. That's good. That's what you need to do.
Problem you've got is attackers don't care.
No.
They don't care whether you're a health service. They don't care whether you're a finance company, whether you're treating cancer patients. They don't care. They're going to do whatever they can to get their aims and objectives complete. Whether that's just purely disruption, whether that's financial matter, they're going to do everything they can to meet their objectives.
Well, back a couple of years ago, you had your first ransomware death out in Germany because the hospital, one of the suppliers got hit. They diverted an ambulance away from the hospital, and the patient died in the ambulance because that hospital had a piece of ransomware. You know, but that is what it is. They just don't care.
There's nothing you can do about that.
No, there's nothing.
Yeah, I mean, there's no security control you can put in place for it. There's no, but again, I suppose it's instant management. At the end of it is what you do.
When
Got a reputational damage, and where you can sort of, again, lessons learned, how you move forward from it as well. I think, yeah, with mine, it's always the more vulnerable, the more critical, I suppose, from a people perspective, they're always the worst you hear about. Like that said, the one in Germany, the stuff going on in London at the moment, the NHS, they're always the worst because you think of the human emotion on the other side, whereas, like you're rightly saying, attackers don't care at all. The more disruption they can cause,
the more likely they are to get paid.
the better it is for them, isn't it?
It's just the sad reality of it.
Yeah, sadly. We covered everything. I think we've done quite a lot, haven't we? I think that's been an hour of us talking, which is probably enough for most people. So I think in terms of ourselves, so again, thank you for everyone for joining us. I hope you found the session helpful. Obviously, if there's any questions that you haven't thought about, but you want to get in touch with us, then you know where we are. We'll be following up with the PureCyber supply chain checklist that you can use to measure the robustness in your organization. So again, that covers a lot of the preventative measures that we've sort of spoken about today. But again, if you need any further information, book a call, chat to a team, come out and reach out to us in any way.
It is, and just to close on that, it is easy in essence to start that managing your supply chain, right? Maybe taking our checklist at the end of this and using that as a foundation to use, right? Just start it. That will mature over the years to come by. And if you do have any issues with that and you're not a client with us, you're always more than welcome to reach out to any of us at PureCyber on LinkedIn and social media, and we'll always try and help.
I think for me, it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, I think all the stories that we talk about are negative because arguably we sit on the far end of it where we're literally dealing with the bad bits day in and day out. Yeah. But actually 99% of the time, everything works seamlessly. So whilst you're in a state of calm and general day-to-day operations, let's take that little bit of resource out of your day and look to make sure we can put small incremental changes in place to make you more secure. So if/when that bad thing happens, you're prepared for it.
It's funny how that's the most positive you've been after an hour of talking. The recording of this session, it'll be available in due course, so feel free to share it with your teams, anyone in the company. But I suppose until next time, thanks for joining us for PureCyber Talks. Look forward to seeing you again soon.